Today, I have the opportunity to speak with Dr. Sarah Needham Beck. She's a researcher and lecturer in dance science and applied physiology at the University of Chichester. In this episode, we really have a focus on her area of expertise, thinking about the physiological demand and workload of dancers. How is a body responding to the things that they're doing, whether that's in class, rehearsal, performance? I think some of the things that are really important that we talk about are the ideas that doing research and collecting this data is meant to help with improving dance training, performance, a dancer's well-being as a dancer and as a human. It's not trying to get in the way of creativity or artistry. And it's also able to be done on a lot of different levels, whether it is in a big fancy lab with all of the equipment and a really elaborate research project with all kinds of data analysts, or as simple as an individual dancer keeping a notebook of how they feel based off of sleep or hydration levels, what classes make them feel like they're working harder, things like that it can also be a very simple and individualized approach to collecting data and looking for patterns for yourself. We talk about all of this and more, so make sure that you check out the full episode. Welcome back to another episode of Dance Med Spotlight, where we talk about all things dance medicine and dance science. On today's episode, I am excited for my guest, Dr. Sarah Needham Beck. Welcome.
Thank you.
My first question for everyone on the show is, what got you to this point of doing what you do?
Yeah, great question. I think, I guess it's my lifelong love really for both dance and science, and sport as well. So I grew up doing 4 classes a week in different dance styles at my local dance school. And I did sports as well. So I played tennis and football or soccer. And I did that until I was 18. And then I went to university and did sport and exercise science. And then during that time was also heavily involved in the Student Dance Society. So kind of kept that going recreationally alongside my studies. So we did performances and competitions. And I always tried to apply my coursework to dance where I could during my degree as well. So then I guess the pivotal moment was when I was looking at postgraduate courses and realized that I could do a master's specifically in dance science in London. So that was sort of, the light bulb moment. That was a perfect merging of all my interests. So I then went and did that, was able to then work in the department there at Trinity Laban for a few years afterwards, where I helped out with staff and student research, which led me to my PhD and where my kind of love of research and my kind of career path in research started. I then did a postdoc research fellowship in a slightly different area. So same kind of research in exercise physiology, but I was working on large scale projects for the British Armed Forces. So we were looking at things like their annual fitness tests and using wearable monitors to look at things like training load, sleep, all different aspects of their training and performance. And that, I think, is where my research skills really developed. And then I've always kept doing dance research projects alongside that, and I'm now back kind of focusing more full-time on dance research again.
That's amazing. So for folks who maybe aren't in the science and medical field and they're hearing this idea of exercise physiology and that sort of thing, what does that mean?
Yeah, so very broad field, but largely looking at the different systems of the body really and how they respond to in the moment physical activity, and then how they adapt over time to kind of increased strain. So how fitness develops in the body really. And that includes all different body systems. In exercise physiology, most typically we're focusing on cardiorespiratory, so heart and lungs, and then kind of muscular systems as well. The cardiorespiratory side is where the majority of my research has tended to be. So looking at how the heart and lungs respond to exercise and how they adapt to increased training stimulus as well.
One of the things that I think is really interesting as research is evolving in this area, when we look at earlier research in, rehearsal or show or anytime an athlete is doing a performance, whatever that looks like for their sport, a lot of times it has involved massive gear and they're hooked up to things. But now we're starting to see these smaller wearable things that aren't getting in the way of the activity that they're trying to do and that you're trying to research. What have you seen with that change in equipment that you're able to use?
Yeah, that's, I think probably one of my main interests in terms of research. So, there's value to all different types of research. So whether that be in a lab or whether that be on stage in studio, kind of in that real life context. But that's where I prefer to be. I'm not really a lab researcher. I like to be in the studio with dancers, kind of in that real world setting. And so that essentially it's a trade-off really between,
Mhm.
in the lab, we can do these really high-tech measurements. We can take blood even to look at, how the body is really responding. We
Yeah.
can have big gas analyzers on that are measuring minute by minute respiratory gases. In the studio, we can bring some kind of portable gas analysis, some portable like capillary fingertip blood sampling. But once we get onto the stage, which is, really we're trying to look at what are the demands of performance, really to
Mhm.
help prepare dancers for those, then, it has to be something that can't be seen, right? That doesn't interfere with the aesthetics or
Yeah.
the dancer's ability to, perform fully in that moment. So, we sort of then look at what might be called more basic equipment. So you don't get as in-depth a measurement, but you're sort of trading that off with that kind of ecological validity, we would call it. So that real world context there. So I'm a
Mhm.
big fan of a heart rate monitor. I still love
Yeah.
measuring heart rate. It gives us so much information. And I've been fortunate to do a few studies where we have snuck chest strap heart rate monitors underneath costumes while dancers are on stage, which has given us some great data. And then there are other wearable monitors now as well. So things called accelerometers that can just be little kind of squares that you can stick sometimes on the top of the thigh or on the lower back. And they measure just accelerations and the movement essentially that someone's doing to then calculate the energy that they're expending
Mhm.
overall. So yeah, it's much easier now to take some of this equipment to give us these more in-depth measurements into onto the stage, into the context that we try to measure it.
Yeah, and anyone who's done dance, I mean, I know I noticed for myself when you're in class, even though we're working hard and all of that, it's something different when you're in a competition setting, on stage, the adrenaline, who knows, maybe something comes up while you're performing and so your body's reacting to that as well. And so it makes sense that we need to have ways to study in the variety of settings and scenarios, not just in a lab where everything can be a lot more controlled.
And I think my ideal research, if I were to design my kind of ideal physiological demand research study, it
Yeah.
would include all of those different settings. So
Mhm.
I would have the dancer in the lab where I would take some in-depth measurements, perhaps looking at their aerobic capacity and how they respond to different exercise intensities. Then I might do something in a rehearsal setting with some of the equipment, but it's a little bit more controlled still.
Mhm.
And then I, just do my pure heart rate monitoring, or even looking at something like a rating of perceived exertion. So the dancer coming off after each number and giving like a 1 to 10 scale. And
Mhm.
then I can look at all of that information together to help me understand that dancer's fitness level and the demand that the movement is placing underneath them in those different contexts that dancers work in. I think that would be my ideal. I've managed to do a sort of one or two dancers in
Mhm.
that context, but not enough to kind of, be a full study at this point.
Mhm.
But it gives
Yeah.
really interesting insights. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I can only imagine. What is something as you've whether it's research you've done or research that you've poured through in preparing for other things, is there anything when it comes to this idea of physiological demand or load that maybe people would be surprised by?
Interesting question. It's difficult because, it's sort of my area. I know inside out, so I have to like put myself in someone else's shoes there. I think, a key characteristic of, particularly in relation to load of dance, is that our training in dance tends to, more often than not, be kind of moderate intensity, but really high volumes and long duration. And, we often talk about dancers being quite in an overtrained state and sort of, trying to work and mitigate against fatigue and work to avoid burnout and, kind of things that can come along with that. But actually, typically, if you compare it to an athlete, and obviously that's hugely varied, but typically athletes tend to do sort of shorter duration, higher intensity bouts. So they might do a morning session in the gym and they might do an afternoon session of skills, hitting tennis balls or whatever the sport is. Whereas in dance, we do, especially, my research at the minute typically is with like vocational degree level full-time training programs in contemporary dance. And, they're pretty much full days, 5 days a week, plus the students quite often being involved in different pieces of work in the evenings and weekends outside of their main curriculum, doing their own training outside of that, taking other classes. So we're talking about a really high volume of training when it comes to dance, which isn't, a surprise to anyone who has ever worked or trained in dance. But from my point of view, then, in terms of helping dancers to manage fatigue and even to increase their fitness, rest becomes the really important concept, because that's where the body builds stronger and gets fitter. So we need that, perhaps a higher intensity, even sometimes strain on the body, but then we need the time to allow it to rest and recover as well.
Yes.
I'm not sure if I've answered your question there, but that's the kind of the balance and the main difference that we see between, typically, broadly speaking, the way that dancers train compared to the way that sports people train.
And I think that's a really important differentiation. And it makes me think of, there was a study I remember reading a while back, and now I'm not going to remember who all was involved in it, but I think they were looking at maybe ballet and contemporary dancers, and they found that like higher skill level dancers actually didn't have as much high intensity time as those who were at a lower skill level. And that I think it was only like 10 minutes out of every hour even reached the moderate intensity threshold, something like that. And I remember the first time I read that, and it's like, but it feels like we're working really hard in class. So that's, that was something that was kind of surprising to me when I first saw that study.
Yeah, I think a really, dances of any genre is a really high skill-based activity. So the more skilled you become at that, the more efficient you become at doing that movement, and the less, I guess, strenuous it is on your body. It's familiar to your body. Your muscles are well conditioned to cope with that specific movement that you're doing. And, our bodies are amazing. They adapt. And so the more we do something, the more efficient we become at doing that thing. So, as we become more skilled, that's, an interesting element there as well.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned just a little bit ago, and this idea of rest and recovery for dancers. And I would say, very broadly speaking, that tends to not be something that dancers are great at, whether that is self-imposed, wanting to like, oh, I need to take more technique classes, I need to get more time in the studio, and that's just, what I need to do in order to progress. Or if maybe it's imposed a bit by schedule placed on them through studio, company, whatever the case may be. Let's talk a little bit more about this whole rest and recovery idea. Is there, I guess, sort of ideal world again, is there sort of a window of how much activity a dancer should have in a day, in a week, versus their recovery time? Like, where is the ideal balance point for that?
think that typically I'm going to give the annoying scientist answer of it depends, right? Which is what scientists always say. But there's a lot of different factors that play into that, is maybe the thing to talk about. So, even, things like how well hydrated is the dancer, how well fueled is the dancer, what are they currently working towards? In some periods of time, it might be totally appropriate to be doing that because you're building up to something. The issue is if we're, sort of redlining and working at maximum capacity all the time, that's where it's going to be difficult. So it's totally possible, and sort of under training theory, good to have these intensive blocks. And this goes into the theory of periodization, though, where you then have to have some time after that to recover. So I wouldn't say that there's a particular ratio or threshold. I mean, particularly in dance, we just haven't done that research yet to have that clear understanding. But I think it's just important to, I guess it would be a bit of a culture shift, but that thought that you don't have to be doing the same thing all the time. It's okay to think, right now, actually, what I'm in this period of is recovery, because I know I have this block of training or this competition that I'm working towards, or this audition, later down the line. So thinking of, different goals at different times, and that it's okay to, change your training habits around those goals. It doesn't have to be the same every week. Otherwise, it's been a wasted week, for example. I think the other thing I'll mention at this point, I'm really lucky at the minute to be involved in a research study at London Contemporary Dance School with my brilliant colleagues, Stephanie Diath and Alyssa Arms. And they have a loosely periodized curriculum there, or they're trying to kind of implement that. So they have different, they have like a block of a few weeks that, the key word around that is prepare, or one that's craft, or one that's perform. And that language even helps the kind of faculty and the students to realize this thing that I was just talking about, that there can be different goals at different times in the training year. What we were talking about earlier as well, just some really interesting things there. So we have been asking the students, to rate the intensity of their classes. The teachers set a intensity range for the class. So people know, this might actually be a lower intensity class. This is going to be a really high intensity class. And so we're doing lots of different measurements alongside that. It's very much like a longitudinal embedded research project with all the great things that they do there to support their students. But we've found some really interesting things around, just sort of small findings, things like if the students do have lots of the lower intensity classes, then they do tend to go and do more classes outside. Because they think, I haven't danced enough this week. So it's hugely complex is the other thing that scientists always say. It's complex and it depends. But yeah, there's some really great work going on there with that project to kind of, at least, if not figure out solutions, but to understand the different complexities that go into that.
Well, and it's so great to think about a school or a studio being able to start implementing some of these ideas, and then also having the science to collect data and see, well, what is this truly doing? What are we accomplishing with this? What is happening with this? Thinking about a studio or a company, if they're like, okay, I'm starting to understand what you're talking about with demand and load and all of that kind of stuff. What might be some ways to help a studio, for example, maybe start to implement some ideas like this?
Yeah, I think if I go back to the approach that London Contemporary Dance School have started to implement, they, in terms of I mentioned planning a kind of intensity range for each class, they use just a really simple traffic light system. So a red, amber, green class, and it's not there's a range. It's not kind of it's devised and planned by the teachers. So it's not kind of me coming in with a heart rate range that they need to be within and how many minutes do they need to spend in this range or that range. It's just we're going to push in this class. It's going to be in between, or actually we're going to use this for something else. I think it's really important And as a physiologist, I think people often think if I'm coming in to talk about class intensity, then I'm going to be suggesting that the class needs to be making them fitter. Whereas actually, personally, I wouldn't ever push that. I think for me, it's more about focused goals. I think that's always my message. So a class within your week might be about trying to run some sequences back to back, to build up a bit of that endurance capability. But other classes, there's so much more to dance than just physical fitness. So, physical fitness is never the primary goal of a dance class, right? We want this underlying, ideally, physical fitness and this physical resilience in the dancers to be able to cope with what they're doing. But actually, there are way more important things in a dance class to be teaching and focusing, educational. And, when we talk about load as well, I mostly look at physiological load, but, cognitive load, emotional load, even, sort of in a contemporary dance environment, students are also being challenged creatively and cognitively when they're in that studio environment. And in other dance styles as well. As I say, there's sort of so much more to it. Sorry, I went off on a tangent there. Again, talking about the complexity. No. I think even just for teachers to start to think about these things and not thinking that everything has to be a 10 out of 10 all the time, but actually maybe 1 week we actually want to focus on more of those creative skills. And so we're going to set some tasks, and the physical load is actually going to be really low, but the cognitive load is going to be really high. And that's absolutely fine. You don't have to come out sweating after every dance class.
I know sometimes I know sometimes, like, whether it's a class that I take or a private lesson or something like that, sometimes I like the ones where it kind of breaks my brain a little bit. And I've had to really think about, oh, we're working on really almost the minutia of movement or that sort of thing. Didn't really sweat a whole heck of a lot, but my brain is going crazy trying to figure all of that out. And it can be a really nice just change of pace to have those kinds of lessons.
Yeah, and it's all important, right? Particularly, as I say, in that educational, that learning context. It's all really, really as important as the other. Whereas I think sometimes when I go into an environment, people think I'm going to kind of say, you got to be sweating all the time. So, yeah, I mean, sort of going back to your original question, I think my advice would just be to sort of plan, and obviously dance teachers do plan a lot, but just try and consider these things in the plan as well. Like, what is the load of this class? Is it more this, more that? And then what would I do next week based on what the focus is at that particular time? Just kind of incorporate it into planning, I think, is a good first step.
Thinking about sort of phases through the year where maybe we're preparing for a show, competition, something where it's kind of a big moment or small series of things. What is maybe a consideration for the dance teacher or the studio owner, whoever's kind of like building out what schedule is going to look like? We tend to currently ramp up more rehearsals and all of that right before. Is that the ideal when we're thinking about load and periodization?
Yeah, so within, as you sort of hinted at there, within the periodization model, kind of training theory, is this idea of a taper, right? So allowing some rest and recovery just before. So you sort of build up and then have this dip just before, so that then you sort of fully recovered and fully energized physically and mentally and emotionally and ready to go and perform at your peak. So yeah, typically, tapering is the term that you could go and look up for what that's called in the sports or training world. It's challenging in dance. I think the example that I always come back to is, and I imagine it's similar in the States and in other countries, this kind of freelance dance model. So a small dance company that maybe has, here it would be like Arts Council funding to put on a particular production. And the funding only starts, a month or a few weeks, if you're lucky, before the beginning of the touring and the performance, particularly if it's, doesn't include a creation phase. So if it's something that's, been made before, and so the dancers are coming in for this really sort of short, concentrated rehearsal period, and then straight out on tour, performing multiple times a week. So there are some, I guess, like systematic like funding, all of those nitty question level problems in the way that dance is funded, which really restrict what we can suggest. And we have to, I think, as scientists, researchers, medical professionals, obviously we have to have an understanding of all of that. So what context are these dancers working under, and what actually is realistic? I mean, I could go in and suggest, oh, you need to put all the dancers under contract 2 weeks earlier so that you can spread out your rehearsals, or so that you can have a taper. But if they don't have the funding for that, and the space and the resources, then that's not a realistic recommendation that they can do anything with. So I think you have to, sort of talk to people and understand their context before you sort of come in and make recommendations.
Yes.
I think it's also, in that scenario, part of the reason that I would advocate for this kind of baseline physical fitness is so that you've kind of got a platform to work off. The sort of the thing we're quite often asked, but how fit do dancers need to be? Like, they don't need to be as fit as a marathon runner. And I mean, correct. It's a very different type of all-rounded fitness. But really, there's obviously an upper limit to this, but the fitter, the better, in a way, because the more fit you are, the lower relative demand any activity is going to place. Dancers are, well, not always, there's improvised dance. I know that you do lots of that yourself. But there's a relatively set demand. If you're doing a piece of rep, then the movement is set. So your body's response to that depends on your fitness and lots of other factors. But if you're relatively fitter, then the relative strain that doing that piece 8 shows a week is going to put on your body is lower. So you're better able to recover and better able to cope with that demand. So I personally see sort of fitness for dancers as this supportive, underlying kind of physical resilience piece, rather than it being this kind of direct link to performance. Because for me, performance is about artistry and skill. But it's that physical resilience to support that. I think I went off on a tangent again, but...
No, I think that's lovely, though. And it makes me think, particularly, so I work a lot with adolescent dancers, and sometimes if they have an injury, especially one that has them out of dance class for a while, it's sometimes this discussion of, do we just let them have that rest time, and then once we're able to start progressing them, we start building them up? Or are there opportunities, granted, depending on what's going on with them, where we safely can continue training other body parts and things where we still can offload whatever the injured thing is, to try to keep their relative fitness, strength, all of that at a more elevated level than if they were to just rest that entire time and then having to build back up. And so, a lot of times, if we can safely keep them doing something, I like to try building out some programming so they don't feel like they have as much catching up to do once they do return.
Yeah, that all sounds great to me. I also think it helps, psychologically, with having to take a break or an injury as well. And also, just to sometimes be able to do an activity for fun. So if there's something the dancer, enjoys but doesn't normally have time to do, just being able to do something different as well, I think psychologically is quite a good break.
Yes. I remember I had a dancer years ago who had a pretty significant injury, and then just a whole series of things seemed to keep popping up. And I mean, it was a journey that we were on together. But one of the things that I had recommended she do in the meantime, and that she ended up absolutely loving, was we came up with stuff for her to do in the pool. So it offloaded the limb that was having a problem, but still allowed her to do some movement. And I remember her coming in after her first time or two of doing that, and she goes, "It was just so much fun. I think I'm going to try going every day." And, it was just this little discovery for herself of something else that she enjoyed doing when she was so busy with dance and other things.
Yeah.
So we've talked a bit about maybe how a dance teacher or a studio owner, company director could try to integrate some of these ideas. What about for a dancer themselves who either wants to try to integrate these ideas or just track some things for themselves?
Yeah, I think that's kind of where the biggest gains can be made in some
Mhm.
ways. And, you know, not everyone's brain kind of works in that way or benefits. So there's a lot of this that's down to what works best for the individual. But I think there's real kind of power to information, right? And data, really broadly speaking, is just like a unit of information. So that could be, how did I feel that day? You know, when I say data, it doesn't have to be what was my heart rate, how much time was I in this zone. Rating a perceived exertion is a really useful tool. So just on a scale of 1 to 10, and you could do it after this class, after this exercise in a class, if you want to, the whole day. But I personally think it would be great for dancers to just kind of keep a journal for themselves, right? Of different, how did I feel during this time? And, you know, also for female dance in particular, that you might notice some cyclical patterns to that in terms of, when do I feel most fatigued? When do I feel at my best? When do I have the best energy to train? When do I feel really strong? So I think, you know, there's real power in that information, and empowering for the individual to just start to kind of notice patterns. And, you know, there are some generalized recommendations out there. The evidence is a little bit shaky behind some of those. So really, like, what's recommended is individualized tracking, because everyone's different.
Mhm.
So even just some monitoring, journaling, tracking for yourself as a dancer, I think would uncover some really kind of interesting insights early on. You know, things like sleep have a huge impact
Mhm.
on training and performance, as well as mood, appetite, all sorts of things. So just some, as I say, it'll be different for each individual what they want to do and how they want to do it. But some kind of tracking, data gathering for yourself, I think unlocks a lot of insight that you might not have thought about before.
Mhm. And I think one of the things that, at least, I mean, for me and my nerdy brain, I like to also kind of do experiments of sorts for myself where, you know, like when I compete doing swing dancing, I would notice as I've gone up in level or added types of competitions that I'm doing, I was starting to get fatigued more at a certain point, and it's like, "Ugh, this isn't great trying to get into the last rounds, that's not when I want to get fatigued." So then starting to experiment with, well, how is my hydration through that time? What if I add electrolytes at a certain time? What about a snack that I maybe have in there, you know? And so, like, different times, different competitions, I would kind of play with different ideas to see, what does this do for how I end up performing or feeling or whatever? And so through that, I've learned some things that have been very helpful along the way and brought up more questions of other things that I might want to experiment with a bit as well.
Always. I mean, any good research, from kind of individual exploration to all research, brings up more questions than
Mm,
answers, which
mhm.
is, you know, what frustrates us and why we love it at the same time. um, yeah,
Exactly.
I think that sounds great. I mean, and yeah, just like you say, noting that down, because we're all busy and we all do different things. So you might then forget, you know, when it comes to the next one,
Mhm,
what worked or what impact that had on how you felt during your training. And how you feel and your body's signals, you know, are really, really important
mhm,
metrics. We don't have to have wearable monitors, although, you know, that's another way that dancers could, if they wanted to, if it's permitted, you know, in the training environment, to have your own fitness tracker, you know,
mhm.
that can give you lots of information as well. Again, it depends what works best for the
Yeah.
individual, really.
Thinking about some of those fitness tracker type ideas, if someone's like, "Ooh, I wanna experiment with this and find some data for myself," are there things that tend to give some more accurate information versus others? Because now we have smart watches, the different, smart rings, chest straps. I mean, there's so many different things. Is one better than the other, easier than the other?
I'll give my annoying answer again, which is it depends. So, yeah, they all serve different purposes, really. I mean,
Mhm,
the most expensive and kind of, you know, all singing, all dancing, um, fitness trackers are mostly designed for kind of outdoor use. So they have really advanced GPS, for example, to track like pace and splits when you're running or cycling or something like that. Now, something like that is not going to give you a lot of information when you're dancing, right? So, yeah, I think, they have, most fitness trackers will have a heart rate monitor on the back. Now, that's a different kind of method of measuring heart rate, which isn't as accurate as if you're wearing a chest strap. But, sometimes if that's something you're interested in, you can pair the two. So you can get a chest strap and pair it with the fitness tracker. But again, like, some information is better than none. You just have to take it with a pinch of salt sometimes. They're not going to be 100% accurate. But yeah, and the more accurate ones can measure things like heart rate variability, which is a good indicator of kind of stress and strain on the body overall. Then there are different ones. So the rings and things sometimes are more accurate at tracking sleep. So that's another use, really, rather than just like inactivity data, like heart rate. Tracking sleep can be a really helpful one. There's sort of, like you say, it's quite a saturated market these days. But I would say for dancers, thinking about what measures are actually going to be useful. So you don't necessarily need the really, really expensive one that is for ultra endurance marathon runners, because you're not going to use half the features on there, realistically speaking. It's difficult to give really specific advice. There are so many different ones out there, but it's all those considerations, cost, battery life. The ones with all the smartwatch features tend to have a shorter battery life because they're trying to do lots of other things. So there's sort of lots of considerations to weigh up there.
One thing that I ran into for myself too, that in hindsight makes complete sense, but I didn't think about beforehand. I was always wearing just, an Apple Watch for a long time. And I would look at it and it's like, that does not seem accurate for as much dancing as I've been doing. And then I was realizing that, there's a lot of things where hands are slipping over the forearm from my partner or things. And so it probably was just getting disrupted all the time for the swing dancing, partner dancing that I was doing. But when I was wearing it in, say, a tap class where nothing is messing with where the watch is sitting, it's like, oh yeah, that seems like a more accurate measure. And so I think, even just considering what is it that you're doing, and is there an area of the body that maybe gets disrupted more in what you're doing that can mess with the reading that you're getting too?
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of those, to get a really accurate reading of heart rate in particular, it needs to be quite tight. Not like uncomfortably tight, but it does need to be quite tight. And there are different types of heart rate monitors, like the chest strap ones. Some people don't like, because again, they don't restrict, but they can sometimes, can feel like they're restricting you slightly. And it really depends on the kind of movement that you're doing as well. As you say, like, there are genre specific considerations there as well. You can get some that are like arm bands that are sort of out of the way a bit more. Or, as I say, like the accelerometers, although they're not really like individual commercial use so much, that go on the lower back. So yeah, it's an ever expanding market, really. The key, I guess the caveat I would give for really getting into like the real data generation is that data has to be meaningful, right? Like, it has to, and the interpretation of that and the processing of that is a whole other kind of topic area. So sometimes you might spend a lot of money on something, it gives you a load of data, but you don't necessarily really know what that means or how to interpret it. So I would say kind of keeping it basic would be my advice. So maybe a little bit of heart rate monitoring, some rate of perceived exertion, noting down how you feel is probably going to give you as much information as spending a lot of money on a fitness tracker for individual use. We have the other end of the scale where we have research, or we have big ballet companies doing kind of monitoring of their dancers, which is they then employ perhaps even data scientists to help them to dig through all of that data.
Yes. And I think there's also an opportunity too, if a dancer is maybe already working with a physio, an athletic trainer, somebody who has some familiarity with these things to say, hey, here is some of the information. What can you tell me about this? Or maybe I can look at it and go, oh, this is telling me that, you're working really hard in this one area. Let's talk more about that and then talk about maybe how we adapt your training a little bit. So I think there can be some collaboration from that perspective too.
Literally just yesterday. So we've been doing a heart rate monitoring we do deep dives within this work with London Contemporary Dance School. So every now and then a question will come up from our longitudinal monitoring, and then we kind of dig a bit further into that. So we have been doing some heart rate monitoring with them this year. And just yesterday we had a feedback session with some of the participants of that. And I put up, their heart rate traces, 90 minutes of a technique class, and said to them, have a look at it. What do you notice from that? And they were great. Their engagement was brilliant. And they came up with some things, that we hadn't even thought about. They were saying, oh, it's interesting that in this class, actually, we all seen our heart rate starts higher, whereas in this class, it's so. What teacher was that again? Because sometimes we warm up because we know a certain teacher, so we'll do more of a warm up before the class starts. And we were talking about cool down. We were talking about different activities. They came up with so much just from looking at that heart rate trace. And it was a really lovely conversation with some very engaged students.
Yeah, that's awesome. I want to take us a slightly different direction. We've talked a lot about what some of this information may tell us, how we're collecting some of the information. Maybe for folks who are doing or wanting to do research with dancers, what have you seen be an effective way to collaborate with the company, the studio, the whatever, without feeling like it's sort of that imposing, I'm here to do whatever?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the most important thing that I would say to people is that collaboration is key, not just for buy-in, but also for making sure that the research is not just for research's sake, right? It's meaningful. Yeah, I mean, I'll come back to the project at London Contemporary again, because that is, I guess, quite gold standard, as I would say, in terms of it's truly embedded in what the school are doing. So we have each academic term, we have a feedback session with the senior management team and the student support team, where we talk about, just trends that we're seeing, certain things that are coming up in the data. It's difficult. I think the question that sometimes have to ask is this a sort of standalone research project, or is this more actually about evaluation with then answering some research questions along the way? Because those are two kind of very different things. So the project we're doing at London Contemporary is very much the latter. It's evaluation. And so we do lots of different data collection. We do a well-being survey once a term, which has measures of coping and stress and just general well-being. My colleague Elsa does a focus group with each of the year groups each term as well. So qualitatively kind of digging in, and that often will be based on primarily something that's come out of that survey. So if we're noticing something around different coping strategies, then that might be something that she brilliantly, she uses lots of creative methods rather than just asking them a question in those to really get some rich qualitative insights from the dancers. But the nature of the project like that is that if we notice something in the data, we then feed that back to the student support team, and they might then adjust the service, right, to improve it, which is fantastic. That's kind of the point.
Yeah.
But from a research perspective, it means that once we've done this for 5 years, we can't do that nice pre-post statistics on it, because the conditions have changed throughout the project. So that's kind of difficult from a research perspective, but great from a care and looking after the dancers perspective, right? Yeah. But both are informed by research design and analysis techniques. So the way that we approach that, as I say, is we then do these kind of deep dives, which would be a more kind of standalone designed study. So we go, okay, so let's have a look at sleep. For example, we've noticed their sleep is not great. It's one of the things we collect data on termly. So we're going to put into the curriculum some kind of sleep hygiene education. And then we're going to look, how does that change? Does that have an impact on these numbers that we're seeing? So that's kind of like a segment of it. So I think, really important to think about what's the primary goal here. Is the primary goal to do a really kind of controlled, tightly designed piece of research to answer a question, which will, then still have meaningful impact as long as you feed back those results well to the management, to the dancers, whoever. Or is it that I want to work, I guess, more in a kind of consultancy capacity, helping to just advise and to improve services and the way that the dancers are supported through their training and performance. So knowing, that's a very long way of saying that, knowing what your primary goal is, I think is really important.
Yes.
And then, collaboration. It has to be in conversation with what's important to you, what's important to the dancers. And I think, I guess on that example again, part of my role in there is, as someone who loves spreadsheets, setting up some kind of automated data analysis and data visualization templates for them to make this all a bit more kind of efficient. So the data comes in and we immediately get some visual outputs that that the senior management of the school are going to be really interested in looking at the patterns across time. But in creating those templates, there's no point me just kind of creating a graph that I think shows something interesting. It's what are the questions? What do you want to know from this data? Like, this is the data we're collecting. What's interesting to you? Like, what do you need to see when you're looking at the results? And then creating that, rather than me assuming this is the interesting bit.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things that you said there that really stood out to me is, regardless of sort of what the goal is coming in, it's really important that there is that return of information to the people who are involved. So it's not just coming in, great, I've got my data, and leave, but being able to say, well, here's what we found, here's what it means. Maybe there are suggestions to come from this, but giving something back to the people who participated in the first place.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. You have to kind of close that loop, as it were, or, keep it open, but it has to, you can't just sort of collect data and leave. That's, not something that we want our dance medicine and science colleagues to get a reputation for.
Yes, definitely.
We don't want to use dancers as guinea pigs. That's not the goal.
No, definitely not. Well, I think this is a good opportunity for a special segment on the show. So on every episode of Dance Med Spotlight, we have the final bow. We've talked about a lot of different things through this conversation. If people walk away with one or two pieces of information, what do you hope that they walk away with?
I think probably the thing I've mentioned a lot of, don't be afraid to kind of embrace science and data in your training and performance. And that doesn't have to be, in the really kind of high tech or in an interfering way to take away from, the goals that you're trying to achieve as an artist, but really to give you extra information and empower you in that. So, as we've said, those that work in dance medicine and science aren't there to put the brakes on you. They don't want to kind of say, you have to stop dancing, dance less. They're really passionate about the art form and letting dancers flourish as both dancers and as humans, right? We also care about the human and making sure that you're healthy as a human. So I guess it would just be not being afraid, thinking of data in a really broad sense, even just tuning into your own sensations and experiences of things like intensity, fatigue, and just noting those down. That is data. That is, all of these things we've been talking about, training science, physiology, perception, it's all really, really important and can really empower you in your training.
I love that. Last and certainly not least, the shameless plug. So if there is anything that you want to promote, an organization that you want to shout out, whatever it may be, the stage is yours.
This is probably a repetition from some of your other podcast guests, but I am very, very fortunate to be serving on the board of the International Association for Dance, Medicine and Science, IADMS. So that will always be my plug. I think it's a fantastic organization. And, I would really urge anyone who's even remotely interested in dance, medicine, and science, which I imagine the listeners of this podcast would be, to get involved. So, there's a website with lots of great resources. We have a conference every autumn time. So our upcoming conference is in Las Vegas, end of September 2025. There's virtual options as well as in person. We'll both be there if people just want to come and hang out with us. Exactly. And it really is that kind of bringing together of all of these wonderful professionals, as you do on the podcast as well, and where I have learned so much about my approach to working with dancers. So my plug is always for IADMS.
And I think even to add a little layer on there for IADMS and the conference or any of the resources online, I think knowing that as a dance educator, folks are welcome, students are welcome. I mean, it's a very broad group that show up. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for folks to come and learn in different ways.
Absolutely. We all tend to get rather excited when lots of new dance educators and dancers and choreographers come along, because then we're not just sort of talking to ourselves, us dance, medicine, and science folk. And we learn more, right? The more diverse voices there are in the room, the more we all learn. So absolutely. Everyone is welcome.
Yes. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for your time today. It was a pleasure getting to chat with you.
Thanks for inviting me. It was great. Thanks.
Dance Med Spotlight is hosted and produced by Alyssa Arms. We discuss all things dance medicine. This has been another episode from Dance Med Spotlight. The Dance Med Spotlight is intended for educational purposes only. No clinical decision-making should be based solely on one source. While care is taken to ensure accuracy, factual errors can be present.